This afternoon, you're going to hear from our most recent commissioned independent research study that was sponsored actually both by the CAQ as well as Financial Executives International, or FEI. And the topic was on internal control over financial reporting, and more specifically, the management review controls, as Joe mentioned this morning. You're going to actually get to hear from the three researchers that did this study. It was led by John Fogarty, who is a retired partner from Deloitte. And he was aided by two very distinguished academics who have much experience in internal control over financial reporting, Mark Beasley of NC State and Doug Prowett of Brigham Young University. This afternoon, John, Mark, and Doug are going to walk through the objectives of the study, how the study was conducted, the findings, and then also some recommendations for all the parties that were involved, the preparers, the auditors, and the regulators. Just one final thing, we anticipate this study will be coming out in late September. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julie. Management review controls are the reviews conducted by management of estimates and other kinds of information for reasonables, like budget to actual comparisons and the like. They're often among the most important financial reporting controls a company has, and for this reason, they're typically in scope for the audit and any inspection thereof. Precision is often very difficult to determine for these types of controls. They require significant subjective judgment, significant knowledge of the business, and experience to perform appropriately. Accordingly, they're a challenge for company management, they're a challenge for auditors, and they are also a challenge for inspectors to inspect audits. Those challenges we determine have created tension between preparers and auditors, and the purpose of this study was to understand those challenges from the perspective of the preparer, and specifically the people who perform and assess the controls within the company by examining 3 MRCs per respondent. We also spoke with the audit teams who audited the specific controls in order to determine the consistency of views between the preparer and the auditor. Because the study was specific to certain identified controls, we did not interview audit committees or PCAOB inspectors. Certainly, their views are important to any discussion of the topic, and we encourage further dialogue, including all parties. The primary objectives of the study were first, to assess whether there might be a breakdown between preparers' need to properly determine their controls are operating effectively, and what the auditor needs to meet the requirements of the auditing standards. We sought to understand areas of difficulty or particular complexity in the design, conduct, and documentation of MRCs, and effective practices in dealing with these areas. Our key areas of focus were the importance of the control for the user, how they ensure precision in the control, the accuracy of the data inputs, and how the information from the output from the control is used. In addition, and most importantly, we wanted to get management's perspective on the level of documentation they feel was needed in order to assess the control's effectiveness, and whether that documentation provided value to management in running the business. We spoke with not only the preparers and assessors and the SOX compliance folks, but most of our interviews included chief accounting officers and in many cases CFOs and corporate controllers. These interviews took place between the spring of 2018 and the fall of 2019. Often the interviews included discussion of the degree to which, if any, preparers felt that the conduct of audits and inspections had changed over the preceding few years. So now I'm going to turn to Doug and ask Doug if he would describe in more detail how the research was conducted.
Thank you, John. So we conducted semi-structured interviews. We had an outline, a script of the types of questions that we wanted to ask, but not in a structured way. It was a semi-structured interview process. with preparers, and then separately, as John mentioned, with the auditors of those preparers. So not just any auditors, but the actual auditors involved with those particular preparers. Each issuer was asked to identify 3 management review controls that are highly subjective in nature. That was the focus of our study. So for example, business performance controls, budget to actual analyses, or other high-level period to period analyses, goodwill impairment, inventory valuation, or revenue estimations as examples. We outlined the purpose of the study, what we were interested in talking about, the types of controls we were interested in, and then we had a dialogue with the preparers about which controls to talk about. So with each preparer of these 8 companies that we spoke with, we interviewed the control owner and operator, and in I think almost every case, the CAO or the CFO sat in on the interviews. We did ask the companies to share some documentation about their management review controls in advance, narratives, process flow diagrams, and so forth. So we were able to study a little bit in advance to get an understanding of the control, the nature of the control, and the context before we did the interviews. For most all of the interviews, all 3 of us were present during those interviews, where we conducted actually 24 different interviews, so 3 per company, involving about 90 people total in those 24 interviews. After the interviews with preparers, we then met with the engagement team members who audited the control to get their perspectives. Those interviews included the lead engagement partner as well as the senior manager on the engagement. And in a few cases, the manager who audited the MRCs that were selected by the preparer. So we were able to get some really great insights from both the preparers and the auditors from those perspectives. On average, on the auditor side, there were 2 to 5 auditors in these interviews. The average was about 3 auditors present per interview. Mark's now going to describe in a little bit more detail the mix of companies that were included in the study.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. And as Doug and John had both mentioned, we focused on interviewing preparers at 8 different organizations. And just to give you a sense for the type of entities that were interviewed, the range in revenue was anywhere from 50 million to 75 billion. So 50M and 75B in the revenue side, and total assets ranged from 2 billion to 140 billion. There was a wide range of industries represented. We had banking and chemical-based companies, a REIT, some oil and gas companies, some tech companies, so variety in industry type. And the companies were sort of evenly split between those that were registrants with the NYSE and then those with the NASDAQ. So a good mix from that perspective as well. 6 were multinational companies, and that left then 2 that were US only. And the companies were audited by the CAQ governing board firms, mostly the big 4, but we did have 1 in the sample audited by an audit firm that focuses more on mid-market kinds of entities. So a nice mixture of industry size and auditee that were a part of this. So Doug's going to touch a little bit on some of the key findings, and then we'll get into more specifics about some of the suggestions for each.
Yeah, so one of our goals was really to convey in a faithful way what we heard from these preparers, to give insights into what they're experiencing and what their views and perspectives are. So to start with, it was interesting. We didn't specifically set out for this, but it came up as part of these interviews. One of the things that stood out to us was pretty much across the board, preparers talking about the benefits of Sarbanes-Oxley 404. I'll give you a few examples at a high level. Improved management focus on internal control. More, which isn't terribly surprising, but this one's interesting, getting more people outside of the finance function in the company educated as to their role in internal control over financial reporting, which I think is a really great side benefit and a possibility for some academic research. Better integrating internal controls into business processes, providing clarity about the processes, responsibilities, and accountability, which ultimately facilitated a better understanding of the financials within and then the finance function, and then also outside of the finance function. In addition, improved financial reporting overall was a perception of the people that we talked to. Although respondents did believe in general that more recent changes in their processes were bringing diminishing returns, often with smaller and smaller incremental improvement. And that kind of transitions me into some of the challenges that we heard from preparers. And these are, we have 35 minutes total, so these are 40,000 foot level, but these are some of the high level challenges that we heard from the preparers. There's a perception that there's constant change in what is acceptable to PCAOB inspectors without changes in the underlying guidance or standards by which either management or auditors are guided. As a corollary of that, there's been a diminished emphasis of the principles-based nature of guidance on assessing internal control. For example, COSO's 2013 framework, the SEC guidance for preparers, and then of course the PCAOB standards for auditors. There wasn't a lot of reference back to that. The reference point was continually, what are the auditors telling us? And what are they getting? What message are they getting from the PCAOB inspection process? And that is what is now driving it. The message came across. That's what's now driving the focus on changes in internal control at this point. Many felt that there was maybe inadequate consideration of the impact of constant change on preparers, which has increased costs and created some tension between preparers and their auditors. I mentioned there's been a perception of a diminishing return and the degree of improvement in internal controls from this continued shift in evaluation and in particular documentation practices. Documentation practices are currently under pressure to increase of these MRCs. So constant pressure to increase the amount and detail of documentation around these MRCs, which the perception was resulted in a great deal, in some cases, of increased cost to preparers, but without perceived incremental benefit in a lot of cases, particularly in the area, like I said, of documentation. So kind of a ratcheting effect where the ratchet turns in one direction, but you turn it back the other way and it just clicks. It doesn't actually turn the bolt. So motion in one direction and not the other, and an incremental increase over time. And then lastly, high level, smaller, less complex entities tended to perceive in the small sample that we had that they are expected to implement internal control over financial reporting in a manner that's, somewhat similar and to larger, more complex entities with a similar level of documentation. And in some cases that produced some frustration on the part of these smaller preparers. So John, I'll turn it over to you and then from there to Mark.
Thanks, Doug. So again, the objective of our study principally was to understand areas of difficulty or complexity in design, conduct, and documentation of MRCs, and to discover effective practices in dealing with these areas. So based on what we learned through all these interviews, the preparers, auditors, and so forth, we did come up with some actions for preparers, auditors, and regulators. And when I say regulators, I mean the PCAOB, the SEC, and even in one case, the FASB. All of these suggestions come from the discussions we had with preparers and their auditors. And in almost every case, were grounded in suggestions they made to us. We kind of synthesized them and tried to perhaps provide some of the reasons for those recommendations being made. So we're going to start with Mark reviewing the suggestions for preparers, and then I'll take the auditors and regulators. Mark?
Yes, John, thank you. From a preparer lens, several of the themes that we picked up on that seemed to really make a real difference in the performance of MRCs was beginning with setting the right tone at the top. A number of organizations we interviewed, it was clear that message from the top was really trying to set the expectation across the entire organization that they wanted to get things right, that financial reporting was incredibly important, that the investment of all members of the team in really doing the MRCs the right way was making a real difference in their effectiveness, but also the efficiency of the performance. So that importance of the tone at the top was pretty loud and clear, and the value that really can play was pretty evident. Along the lines of that, one of the things we observed is that several entities had found some real advantage when they had appointed a SOX sort of leader. The process of really designing and implementing controls and really helping orchestrate the whole SOX compliance efforts, that when there was a SOX leader that helped centralize a lot of that effort, that was making a real difference in coordination across the entire entity, helping clarify misunderstandings, and just led to a lot of better training and education on the importance of what they were doing and the effectiveness of how those MRCs were being performed. So it seems to be taking a lot of noise out of the process when there's a real clear leadership role in that area. Another theme or a recommendation or suggestion is to really, for preparers to look for opportunities to identify controls where there could be multiple benefits from the performance of the control, meaning basically looking for controls that really provide value from running the business perspective, that also provide value from a financial reporting perspective. Instead of just having standalone internal controls for financial reporting that really weren't being used by business leaders to make business decisions, that the buy-in and the embrace of the importance of the MRC really seemed to be enhanced when it was a control that was really helping them make key business decisions. Another observation we had that ties into suggestion is to look for opportunities where these MRCs could be centralized more in the process of how they're performed across a multi-location kind of entity. Organizations, some of our interviewee entities had really taken a more centralized approach to how they design MRCs across different business units to have more consistency in the types of MRCs being performed at each business unit. So there was less variation across subunits of the entity and the design and implementation of the MRC. So when there's an opportunity to apply a lot of the same high-level MRCs across different business units versus letting those be independently determined, seemed to really gain some real efficiency and effectiveness in that. With today's environment and technology, another suggestion is to look for opportunities where there might be aspects for entities, preparers to automate some parts of the MRC process, particularly in the data collection and integration that's being used, the data being used for the MRC process, is looking for more and more ways to automate that data flow and looking for ways for technology to enhance the performance of the MRC. Keeping in mind, it wouldn't necessarily eliminate the judgment process of an MRC, but might enhance some of the inputs and then how the output is being used when there's some opportunities for automation. Another suggestion was tied into capturing the expertise of those that are performing the MRCs, really capturing a better understanding of how they go about making those subjective judgments as they perform an MRC, how they look at precision, and capturing that knowledge and expertise to make sure they could be using that for training purposes, as well as just the reality as people move throughout their careers. Sometimes those performers move on to other roles. And so capturing that expertise while they're in that role could help for the transition to a new performer as we get further into, with new people performing that. A lot of subjectivity involved in estimates, and those that several entities talked about the judgments that were especially subjective in nature, really finding benefits in putting what we say in the paper, more eyes on the judgment. That being, have more people within the management team look at the judgments being made by the MRC performer to make sure they're comfortable with those judgments being made, especially when they're pretty high on the subjectivity scale. And so really looking at multiple eyes examining the judgment to make sure everybody's comfortable with that. And tied with that would be also a recommendation, suggestion, that they really pay attention to the nature of assumptions that are being made across different business units, particularly in the assumptions being made that are inputs to certain MRCs, to make sure there's consistency in those assumptions across not only the internal control of financial reporting, but that same assumption may be used for business decision making, and they want to make sure there's consistency in the judgment there about the assumption. And so really trying to reconcile assumptions being made both in the performance of the MRC for internal control of financial reporting purposes, as well as for decision making. Several of the entities had found a lot of benefits in creating very clear timelines and expectations of when the control should be performed, whether it might be a month-end control or a quarter-end control or a year-end control. Very clear deadlines, very clear accountabilities, and that discipline really seemed to aid in the performance of the control, and that there was pretty clear expectations what should be done when, and that seemed to really help improve the performance of those controls and the timeliness of when they're done. Back to the training, also just keeping in mind that job changes happen all the time, people come and go, and to not forget that periodic training and education on what is an MRC, what's the purpose of this particular one, is always something to keep in mind, that we don't want to, that preparers want to make sure they don't lose sight that different people could be sitting in different roles over time. So keeping their eye on that constant need for training and education. And then touching on then just fostering an open and pretty open and transparent dialogue with the external auditor. That we heard that over and over again, the benefits of having early conversations with the auditor and keeping a very strong open line of communication to set expectations clearly and timely was making a huge difference. And that sometimes might include, in some cases, when an MRC is impacted by performance by a management level committee, that perhaps even including in some cases inviting the auditor to observe a management meeting where an MRC is actually being performed. We heard that with some of the entities, that they were actually inviting their auditor to participate. Now, I'll have to admit, we did hear from others that there's no way they would do that. So there's a little bit of a mix on that. So that highlights several of the suggestions for the preparer side. I'll turn it to John to touch on some for auditors.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things that struck us about the auditor and regulator recommendations is that there's a lot of similarity between the two. But I'm going to start with one that really relates mostly to the auditors. And it's one that I've heard throughout my career in public accounting for nearly 40 years, which is to be clear with the preparers about your expectations at the outset of the engagement, and where changes do occur, to communicate them clearly and timely. Now, various reasons were given for this being an issue. Sometimes it's the partner rotated and there's a somewhat different approach from year to year. It could be other personnel changes on the engagement. It could simply be the process of review taking place over a period of time, and new questions being raised by additional reviewers. But through all of it, there was also a strain of thought that inspection results influenced changes in approach and levels of documentation. And that could be formal through the methodology or changing policies of the firm, or it could be informal simply through people hearing about inspection findings and deciding that they would change what they were doing based on what they had heard. So again, management very much wanted to be kept informed and not surprised by changing requirements. The next thing is something common to auditors and regulators, and it relates to the level and extent of documentation needed to evidence the effectiveness of an MRC. This was discussed in every interview. And there, as Doug mentioned earlier, there was a widespread view that increasing levels of documentation was providing a diminishing return on the effectiveness of controls. So from the auditor perspective, even without any change in the regulatory rules or behavior of inspectors, there was a view that many times the documentation was excessive or being changed, as I mentioned earlier, even though there had been no inspection finding that would prompt it. So firms were asked to really consider the extent of the documentation needed. The next one has to do with the control environment. Many respondents felt that the control environment was extremely important and that in fact they had very good control environments, but in practice, although the guidance clearly emphasizes control environment, that in practice it really did not seem to affect the scope of the work or the levels of documentation or other work necessary to satisfy the auditors. So a suggestion was that the firm should really reevaluate the way they look at control environment and whether in practice it really affects the scope and extent of their work. The next one, again, applies both to auditors and regulators, and it's a plea to minimize the disruption when making changes to policies and methodologies, and be cognizant of the ripple effect of those changes across many engagements. And I know all the firms and the PCAOB are aware of this, but once again, we heard from the respondents that often they feel that disruption is not properly considered. And lastly, as Doug mentioned earlier, the smaller entities tended to feel that they were being required in practice, but not in the guidance, to have essentially the same type of documentation and approaches to controls as a larger entity. So again, a look at what's actually happening in practice was desired. If I may turn to regulators now, Doug mentioned this earlier, and often it's more important what people don't say than what they do say. And the fact is, COSO and SEC guidance were rarely, if ever, mentioned in our dialogues with the preparers. Clearly, the PCAOB guidance was viewed as the primary guidance as interpreted by the auditor. So notwithstanding that all the guidance was aligned at the time it was issued, it appears that preparers perceive a gap between the actual implementation of the guidance on audits and what was originally intended in the principle-based guidance from the SEC, particularly, and the PCAOB standards. It's not surprising that this would happen because standards always have to be interpreted and their application will change over time. But again, the respondents mentioned that the degree of change, the disruption that came from it, was excessive and led to diminishing returns on effectiveness. So in this regard, the respondents desired that all regulators think about not only what the guidance actually says, but how it's actually being implemented. In that regard, we also, again, heard about documentation of effectiveness of MRCs being a crucial issue. We recommended that the PCAOB look at whether there's an overemphasis on documentation as audit evidence, and that other forms such as inspection and observation might and inquiry supported by appropriate documentation could rebalance this to some extent. Another recommendation regarding the inspection process is to recalibrate it a bit to recognize the subjectivity that exists with most of these types of controls, and recognize that cannot be fully eliminated from their performance. Like the recommendation for auditors, the same is true for regulators with respect to the control environment. It'd be important to look at how it's actually being addressed in practice and hopefully bring that more in line with the principle-based guidance. And this could also be an area for further research. The next item of some degree of controversy, every respondent, virtually everyone, cited that they felt there was an overemphasis on certain accounting measurements that really were not particularly important to investors, and that caused a great deal of extra work on controls in their audits. And the usual example of this was goodwill. So this is where it's both an accounting and an auditing issue. Obviously, GAAP is GAAP, and many of the preparers felt this example of goodwill was not particularly of interest to investors, and that might be another good area for further research. But from an audit perspective, there's also risk and materiality and how they play into the scope of the work, where you might have a very large quantitative amount like goodwill, but in reality, the risk of its misstatement and its relationship to materiality is apparently not being adequately considered in the views of preparers. And lastly, again, as Doug mentioned, the view is that in spite of the guidance going to great lengths to talk about smaller entities and having different forms of control and so forth, that in practice that's not really the case. So recommendation there is for regulators to look not only at the guidance that they provide, but how that's actually being implemented on audits. So with that, those are our recommendations. If we have a few minutes, we might take a few questions.
So it looks like we have about 3 minutes, John. And one question that came through, and since I'm going to read you the question, I'm going to let you two answer it. The question is, did we identify situations or cases where preparers and auditors thought that including auditors in meetings where MRCs are actually performed change the actual process of performing those controls? So was there any concern about that expressed in what we heard?
I'll touch on it, and then John, you can.
Yep.
What else? But we definitely heard both from a management side and the auditor side where that was happening, that they had found it incredibly helpful to really observe management going through the process of talking about the judgment and evaluating the documentation and reaching a conclusion. But what they did talk about, particularly from the audit side, was just being very careful and clear that the auditor's role was clearly to be an observer and not a part of the decision maker. So to not be providing input, but to be there to sort of watch the process unfold. And I think they felt like that was providing very strong evidence for them to see the control perform. But they did talk about some caution with their being careful that, what we don't want to see is there being a pre-meeting of management without the auditor there, and then let the auditor come in and watch a process when the decision was really made at a different meeting. So there's some skepticism that needs to be applied in that particular case.
Yeah, I would agree, Mark. I guess I only add that I don't recall anybody saying, oh, well, that would change the outcome of the control. I think it was more the ones who objected to it said, look, this is a private conversation. We don't want it to be influenced by auditors being there. But I know from my own experience as an auditor, being able to observe these meetings going on is far more effective than reading PowerPoint decks and the like, because you can actually see the interaction of the people.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we're about out of time. If there's any other questions, I don't know that we have time to evaluate or to answer those, but I will just kind of add that this whole process was a really interesting process to hear directly from preparers and from the auditors who were involved with those preparers in their perspectives of what's going on. And we tried both to faithfully represent what we heard from those preparers and then to use our experience and background second to bring these recommendations. So John, back to you, I guess, to wrap it up as our fearless leader.
Well, thank you, Doug. I hope everyone finds this interesting, and that we will be publishing the paper in the next month or two. I think we've been through it in some detail here, although quickly. I'll just add that over most of the respondents felt that there had been a lot of changes, more focus on MRCs over time, but the observations that they have are still valid at this time.